I can't see why the government is still sticking to this figure, except of course that it doesn't want to increase borrowing, it doesn't want to increase taxes, and it certainly doesn't want to cut spending. So it's in a bind.
Hello and welcome back to Spectator TV. Today we are going to be talking about the Strategic Defence Review, which has finally been published this week and is the subject of much media discussion. To talk about this, I'm delighted to be joined by Lord Roberts, Andrew Roberts, who wrote a very important and influential cover piece for The Spectator last year called Farewell to Arms, which looked at the dilapidated state of the British Armed Forces. Andrew, thank you very much for coming into The Spectator.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Freddie. It's nice to be back on your show.
Well, home turf, I hope. And I would like to just, it did prove to have been quite an important cover, your piece. I mean, everything you said was proved true, and quite a lot of what you were talking about is now in the Strategic Defence Review. That's
right, yes. It's very pleasing, actually, to write a piece of journalism and to have people be positive about it and then actually do something about what you've been calling for. I did have sources within the British Army that helped me with that, and so of course in a way it was quite sort of inside the beltway kind of journalism, but this strategic review has said that the things that I was calling for, that the Spectator was calling for, are going to be in their policy recommendations.
The obvious question is, how on earth can we possibly pay for it? Because while the commitments are quite bold, the review sounds pretty bold. The second part, how it's actually paid for part, is the tricky question, isn't it?
Precisely, yes. Actually, it's a very impressive piece of work. There's been a lot of work that's gone into it, 11 months in the making, tremendously high-powered individuals, of course, who are behind it. They mention enemies as opposed to just, antagonists. They have 62 recommendations, which are very radical, and the government's agreed to all of them. A lot of it makes your flesh creep, stuff to do with biological weapons and pathogens and so on is really nerve-wracking stuff. But they do come up with a lot of really impressive recommendations, including, as I say, these ones to do with rebuilding the shells and the munitions. There's only one sentence that I would take huge issue with, which I don't believe that the actual writers believed themselves when they wrote it. It's on page 10, column 2, paragraph 2, and it says that we are confident that everything we have in this report can be delivered under the financial terms set out by the government at the moment, which they claim, they correctly state, are 2.6% at the moment, if you include the intelligence services, which I don't think we necessarily should do for a defence review, and secondly, on the assumption that this ambition of the government, we all know what the word ambition means in politics actually, i.e. nothing, goes up to 3% of GDP by the 2030s. And the 2030s are so far away apart from anything else that why should Putin wait for us to be happy and ready for him? It's just, there are lots of unanswered questions, but overall it's a superb piece of work.
Which ties into a big political problem which has affected the Tories almost more than Labour, or certainly for the last few years more than Labour, which is that a lot of policy talk, a lot of document preparation revolves around the media side of things, getting the headlines right in relation to a strategic review or something like that. But the implementation is where we seem to just struggle and fail. And it is, of course, the Tory party, as you pointed out in your piece, that had oversaw a complete dilapidation of the British Armed Forces.
Hollowing out was the phrase used actually, of course, by Ben Wallace, a Conservative Secretary for Defence, and it's a correct term. You know, he was brave to have used those words. It struck me, brave politically at least. But it is, and I'm speaking here as a Conservative peer, it is so depressing to think that the Conservative Party was the party of defence under Margaret Thatcher, and no, that was about the last time, frankly. But when we stood as the party of defence, people knew where they were with the Conservative Party. They knew that they would fund the whatever was necessary. But then you have the end of the Cold War, the peace dividend, the spending of the peace dividend, and now, you know, there's virtually nothing left. So we've got to go back. The Conservative Party must go back to being the party of defence. And there's only one way of doing that, and that's spending the money necessary. Oh, and can I point out one other thing about the whole debate about GDP, percentage of GDP? I've already done it earlier by mentioning the 2.6 and the 3% numbers. The fact is that, of course, intellectually, it's illogical to think that threats can be dealt with percentages of GDP, because they're two totally different things. One is a strategic threat, and the other is the amount of money that you might have. They don't go up and down with each other. And yet, it's the only way, it seems, that we're willing to talk about financing. We should have a figure that we think we need in order to deal with it, and it shouldn't have necessarily any connection with GDP, because that goes up and down.
Well, because if we're talking about war with Russia, which was what a lot of people in defence are now talking about, 5%, which is now the sort of NATO ultimate aim, it seems, wouldn't be enough. I mean, if you're going to have a war with a power as great as Russia, it'll mean World War II levels of spending. which is
why always money spent on deterrence is much less when it's successful than the money you have to spend if you try and save the cash early and then wind up getting into a war, which are always wildly more expensive.
You mentioned the terrifying things in the review, and this word lethal or lethality is being used, and it seems to be echoing a bit what Pete Hegseth in America likes to talk a lot about, the lethality of the American armed forces. The Defence Review aims for 10 times the lethality. Where does that number come from?
It comes from the increase in essentially the number of people and things you can destroy with the modern weaponry that they're going to be buying. What it doesn't take into account is, of course, the fact that the British Army is just over 70,000 men at the moment. They want to bump that up a lot, want to bump almost 10%. But even if they bumped it up to 10%, it would still be much, much lower than it's been pretty much at any other time since the end of the Second World War. So it's not lethal. It's going to be essentially lethality per army rather than lethality per individual. But it's not actually going to be enough, really, to just concentrate on lethality. You also actually have to have the boots on the ground to fight wars. Also, you don't necessarily need men in planes. In the future, in 5-10 years in the future, a warplane fighter jet with a human in it is going to be shot down by a fighter plane without a human in it, because computers are so much quicker. So there is this sense that we might be starting to invest in very expensive weaponry that might become obsolete fairly quickly.
So the human military pilot is going the way of the cavalry.
That's right. Yes, it's a question of the human being in the loop, not on the loop. When he's actually in the loop, that's dangerous, because an algorithm can shoot him down. But you also always need humans on the loop, so that they are in charge of the algorithms that decide how these weapons work. So it's a sea change, which this Defence Review is all over. It really does understand that. It's not just saying, look, put money into F-35s. It's also constantly innovate. And what it does say also is that you've got to innovate at the speed as if you're in wartime.
Yes.
And that's a really important differentiation, it strikes me.
Well, I've seen different estimates of what the drone commitment is, maybe up to 2 billion. My understanding is even that is not nearly enough, given the speed at which AI drone combinations now are developing, and the speed at which China is developing them, and perhaps Russia as well.
And other countries. Israel's one of the most advanced. Ukraine itself is fantastically advanced with regard to its drones. And once you've got drones shooting down other drones over battlefields, and you've got drones that, such as the Ukrainians are using at the moment, which are able to operate even if the electromagnetic fields have been shut down by the Russians. You are in a completely new sort of area of warfare. Do you know there are now more people killed by drones in Ukraine than by shells? And so that's 2 billion, as you mentioned. But actually, when you go down and read the commitments, the 62 commitments of the Strategic Defence Review, there are some massive ones, like 15 billion on our nuclear, upgrading our nuclear deterrent, but there's 400 million here and another one for $1 billion there, and you add, there's one that costs 7 billion, one of the commitments. You add them all up and you think, hang on, if we're doing this, and some of them very important, the 400 million that I just mentioned, for example, is for service families having decent houses and accommodation, to live in, and this must be done, because anyone who's visited a military site recently realises what squalor they have to live in, these people, and we've got to try and retain the best, and we can't if we don't upgrade their houses. But once you add up all of these things, you can very easily get into, very easily get into numbers that are just simply not covered by 2.6% of GDP.
Recruitment, as you said, is something that has to be addressed, and we need to get more people into the British Army. Is there enough of that in the review? And is it the type of recruitment we need to be rethinking, particularly if we are moving towards automated warfare in some ways, possibly beyond drones, looking at robot warfare? I mean, is the warrior soldier, is that something that's going to change?
No, the warrior soldier is still going to be absolutely necessary. It can't all be done by people in offices, working remote control. Actually, the grit that's still needed, the courage, the commitment, the patriotism, all of those old-fashioned sounding values that saw our forefathers come through their challenges are still going to be needed in the British Army, and that's another of the positive aspects of the Strategic Defence Review. It does recognise that, but it, as I say, it claims that it's confident that it can be done over a 10-year period with these present levels of funding and increased levels, supposedly this ambition of 3%. But that simply is not enough, and NATO is going to demand 3.5% in a couple of weeks anyway at its meeting this month. So I can't see why the government is still sticking to this figure, except of course that it doesn't want to increase borrowing, it doesn't want to increase taxes, and it certainly doesn't want to cut spending. So it's in a bind.
Do you think the government is right? Do you think defence analysts are right to focus so much of their attention on Russia, which obviously is a major security concern at the moment, but there's a lot of focus on the North Atlantic because of Russia and so on.
Yeah.
But shouldn't a Strategic Defence Review look at threats more broadly? I mean, we don't know.
No. It does. It looks at out-of-area threats. It mentions a lot, actually, about Iran and North Korea. But one of the assumptions it's making, and probably correctly, is that one of the reasons that we're in such a bind at the moment is the United States is, of course, swivelling off towards Southeast Asia and the threat posed by China. And so it's really important for us to recognise that if we're going to be part of helping against China, one of the actual positive ways of doing that is to stop Russia from being successful in Ukraine. And although this isn't mentioned in the Strategic Defence Review, it's very clear that were Putin to be victorious in Ukraine, then he would be putting pressure on NATO in ways that would be, again, very expensive to deal with, including, of course, sabre rattling in Lithuania.
Which is a different way of looking at it to the way people in the Trump administration seem to think about Ukraine, which is that the Ukraine war has brought China and Russia closer together, and that resolving the conflict very quickly is important because strategically you don't want Russia and China to be closely aligned.
Yes, this is a big mistake that's been made ever since the 1930s, the idea that democracies can push authoritarian powers away from each other, and that actually what they really want is to be nicer and kinder to us. This is not what historically has been the case. The fact is that Russia and China share a 4,200-mile border. They have made it quite clear that they want sort of ever closer union and friendship, and there's nothing that the Americans could do in order to buy off the Russians from this axis that they are part of, and certainly nothing that they could do morally, even outside the normal parameters of realpolitik. There's nothing that they can do. So, I think this is one area where the Trump administration is likely to be disappointed.
And Britain sees itself as, a lot of people in the British government see themselves as the people who have to keep America aware of the danger that Putin and Russia poses. With Trump in power, could that backfire as a strategy?
Well, it sort of already is backfiring in a sense, because it's not working. And I think we've got to face the fact that there's a very interesting report put out by the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and what IISS said, and this was only last month, was that with the Trump administration essentially pulling out of Europe, it's going to start next year, and they've got over 90,000 troops here. The rest of Europe is going to have to stump up something in the region of, this is over the next generation, over the next 25 years, $1 trillion. And in order to do that, you've got to buy, and what you need from that money, apart from 100,000 or so extra troops, is going to be 400 new fighter jets and 20 new destroyers and so on. You know, these are phenomenally expensive. So what we've got at the moment, it strikes me, is a huge hiatus between the increasing level of threat that we do know about and any kind of realization about the kind of sacrifices that we're going to have to make in order to make up this essentially, loss of the American umbrella.
Well, lastly, Andrew, on the loss of the American umbrella, what do you think explains the shocking lack of foresight from defence planners in this country and the government more broadly, that we don't actually have enough of an industrial base to actually create enough munitions if we were in a war? Why have we been so bad at thinking about this for so long?
The munitions story is slightly different in that since that article that the Spectator kindly asked me to write, BAE and Babcock and other British firms have actually been starting to get orders, and with regard to 155mm shells, we're going to be making 16 times more than we were. So in that sense, industry is being able to be ramped up for the imminent problem, the imminent threat. But you're right, overall it's an incredibly long process, not only of course to set up the factories, but also to train the engineers there, and to get the apprentices up and running who can work out what's needed in terms of just sheer production. It's something that takes years, it costs a fortune, and you're right, we haven't shown up until now anything more than a willingness to rub our hands with glee and spend a dividend that we thought was going to be permanent and acted as though it was going to be permanent, but very clearly is not. And we need to wake up, and one of the good things about this review is that it does wake us up. There are phrases in there, really powerful phrases like the international chessboard has been flipped over.
Yeah.
I love that phrase, because you're thinking about the rest of that sentence is going to be there have been moves on the international chessboard, but not at all of it. It's been flipped over, and that's what this excellent review states. But what it doesn't state is that we're anywhere near ready to put in the financial sacrifices necessary.
Well, Andrew Roberts, thank you for sounding the alarm in The Spectator, and please do so again.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very kind of you, Freddie.